was the best possible deal the European Commission said about the agreement on trade tariffs between the European Union and the United States. The vast majority of European products exported to the world's largest economy will have to pay 15% in customs duties. EU Decoded explains the impact of the imperative America First on the European economy.
In 2024, the US imported $606 billion worth of goods from the EU and exported around $370 billion worth. To reverse the deficit, the US will now apply a 15% tariff to approximately 70% of the goods it receives from the EU. The auto industry is one of very few sectors viewing this positively, since it will pay 15% instead of the 27.5% imposed at the beginning of Trump's term. By contrast, steel and aluminium will continue to be levied at 50%. The parties agreed that tariffs will not apply to some strategic sectors for both blocs.
The new tariff represents a substantial increase compared to the average 4.8% on goods applied before Donald Trump came into power this year. Let's hear what Europeans think about this deal.
It's not the greatest of news. Maybe people who invest in these companies, for the government in general. But for me personally, I'm not too concerned.
I don't think we should attack back. We also have to be a reliable partner, and that's not in the idea of free trade that the European Union is all about.
Of course, we should try to look outside the EU, outside the Euro-Atlantic front, let's say, maybe Asia.
It's very important to open up to new markets. So personally, I think that we should ratify the agreement with Mercosur as soon as possible. But the US market cannot be replaced in the short or in the medium term.
Euronews reporter Amandine S. has been covering this topic. Why does the European Commission consider 15% a good deal when, for example, the UK obtained a 10% rate?
Well, the European Commission claims 15% is a good deal because the UK 10% tariff is not an all-inclusive rate, which means it doesn't incorporate the existing US import tariffs applied to the UK. And another point is that the UK created preferential duty-free quotas for US beef and US ethanol, while the EU didn't make such concessions.
What will be the impact on European Union's companies? Is it likely that some of them will move their factories to the US?
So Bernard Arnault, the CEO of LVMH, has already declared that Louis Vuitton will open a new manufacturing site in the US. AstraZeneca also pledged to open a new plant in Virginia. Now the economists we talked to were not convinced European companies will move their factories to the US on a large scale. First, we don't know for how long these tariffs will be in place. Donald Trump is known for being quite unpredictable. And second, companies producing in the US now have to pay more to import some of the inputs they need for their production. So it's another impediment.
During the negotiations, the US president also asked for commitments from the EU on energy and arms purchases and more investment. How big are those commitments, and can the European Commission fulfill those promises?
So the European Commission promised that European companies will invest at least $600 billion in the US by 2029. Now it's not really clear how it will happen because the European Commission cannot tell European companies where to invest. Then the European Commission pledged to purchase $750 billion worth of US LNG, oil and nuclear energy products. Now again, it's not really clear because it's not Brussels that would buy this energy. And Donald Trump claims the EU will purchase American weapons, but Brussels is not competent for arms procurement. So again, big question mark.
The EU and the US trade around 1.5 trillion euros per year, and the two economies combined represent a market of 800 million people and nearly 44% of global GDP. Despite being two economic giants, the EU has a more dependent political position due to US military protection within NATO. The reaction from several European leaders was quite lukewarm. For example, French Prime Minister François Bayrou stated that it's a dark day when an alliance of free peoples resigns itself to submission. His Dutch counterpart Dick Schoof said that no tariffs would have been better.
Our guest is Nicolas Poitier, research fellow at Bruegel, a think tank based in Brussels. After the deal, the European Commission continued negotiating with the United States in order to obtain more tariffs exemptions on certain products and quotas for others. Is this the right move, or it might be necessary to use rebalancing countermeasures?
So far, the Europeans have shied away from this. They announced countermeasures with the intention also kind of to bring the United States to the negotiation table. I think if we would see countermeasures, they would really depend on basically to which extent this agreement will unravel. We could see something that's very limited and that's also really targeted on specific products where the pain is very big for the US, but relatively small for the EU. If we see something like a big unraveling of the agreement, that will not suffice. And then we might see measures that actually also are very detrimental for the European Union itself.
So the French government advocates the use of the anti-coercive instrument, which would prevent American companies from accessing European public procurement. What would be the implications of that?
Even though the European Union has a trade surplus when it comes to goods, it has a deficit when it comes to services. All the digital services that we use, Facebook, Google, they are American services. And there was this idea of targeting them specifically, and the anti-coercion instrument would allow that. And here really the question is, how can you build a digital single market that would allow European companies to scale to the same extent that Google and Apple did in the past, and then compete with these companies on the global stage, rather than us just kind of importing these quick scaled services from the United States.
The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that the paralyzed World Trade Organization should be replaced with another institution. Would that make any difference in the current protectionist trend?
I'm not so sure it would make much of a difference. The reality is that most trade is still based on WTO principles, including trade with the United States. The problem with the WTO is that it has not been able to reform itself. And there are many issues that are open, and some of these issues is why the US is not happy with it. But there's probably a need to create new ways of making progress on these issues, for instance, in cooperating more with other countries than, for instance, in East Asia.
The European Commission has a mandate to negotiate trade deals on behalf of the entire bloc, but this needs to be approved by the EU member states, which could be a difficult process. On the other hand, the President Ursula von der Leyen emphasized that the US signed 76 trade agreements and intends to have new ones. This strategy is enough to offset this blow by the US remains to be seen.